He didn't take into account that nothing was aspirated, nothing was regurgitated, there were no injuries on her back. Would you buy a used car from Aaron Dillard? His story is a lie meant only to benefit himself. When he created his story, he had over a decade of prison that he used this to reduce to zero. Now, he's got even more at stake. He's facing decades in prison right now, and he's getting another letter from the prosecutor, which is the same thing he got in 2008, resulting in no time for lying to that officer. Would you rely on Aaron Dillard for anything except to lie? I want to talk about the autopsy. Dr. Michael Chambliss wasn't the medical examiner for Kenosha County. He came down on December 4th to do the autopsy. He did his autopsy report, and then he did nothing else with the case. He didn't review reports. He didn't send things out for studies. I think he said he didn't even review the toxicological results. He did an autopsy, and then he turned it all over to the medical examiner's office, and his role was done. That autopsy was in 1998. I think the faxed autopsy report was in February of 1999. The person he turned it all over to, Dr. Maureen Lavin, we never heard from her in this trial. A side note, even though Dr. Chambliss, even though the only report he ever did said that the cause of death was undetermined, he felt pretty comfortable in court giving an opinion to cause and manner of death without having done that investigation that a medical examiner does. Do you remember Dr. Lindsay Thomas testifying? The renowned and respected forensic pathologist? The prosecution attacked her because she didn't know the acronyms Mark Jensen and Kelly Labonte used in their emails. But Dr. Chambliss, he told you that his involvement in this case and his investigation was done at the time he issued that preliminary report. So what did he note and how did he explain it? He agreed that Julie Jensen had a substantial amount in her stomach. He agreed there was no way of knowing how long it was in there. It was very likely she had delayed gastric emptying. He identified petechiae in the cardio area. He found no injuries to the insides of Julie Jensen's lips and cheeks. He found no fluid in the nose. There was no aspirated food in the respiratory system. He found zero evidence of external forces to the chest. He found zero evidence of trauma to the abdomen. There were no rib fractures. And then he identified a small amount of hemorrhage involving the soft tissues and muscles attached to the left, second, third, and fourth ribs. Remember this theory that exists that from Aaron Dillard that this grown man climbed on top of Julie Jensen's back and forced her lungs to close. Set aside whether the evidence actually established that this hemorrhage was just post-mortem lividity or congestion since Julie Jensen was lying on her side. And set aside for a moment that the picture actually just shows darkness on all the ribs on that side of the body, demonstrating that this is just congestion. Dr. Chambliss even said this could be post-mortem artifact. He testified he doesn't know when this injury, if it even is an injury, even occurred. He said it could have been caused by bumping into something. And then he was asked whether Julie Jensen's death could have been positional asphyxia, whether she had gotten herself into a position and she couldn't breathe. And he said no. And the reason he said no is he said, because that wouldn't explain the hemorrhage on the ribs. This is the very thing he just had testified could have been caused by bumping into something, could have been post-mortem artifact. And if it was a hemorrhage, he was unable to say when it occurred. But then the reason he rejected the idea that Julie Jensen might have gotten herself into a tough breathing position is that it didn't explain the very thing he agreed had several completely innocent explanations for. I don't know what to do with that. That's confirmation bias. That's some sort of circular logic that does not belong in a courtroom. That's wholesale reliance on Aaron Dillard. Even with that, then Dr. Chambliss agreed that if Aaron Dillard's a liar, then Dr. Chambliss's cause and manner of death would be undetermined. Science didn't lead to Dr. Chambliss's opinions. He made the science fit the story told by Aaron Dillard. Dr. Mainland also, she says, that could be hemorrhage, it could be congestion, I don't know what it's from, when it's from. Could be post-mortem artifact. After Aaron Dillard, it's hemorrhage, it's terminal asphyxia. She said she wouldn't buy a used car from Aaron Dillard. I'm sorry, but that says all you need to know about how Dr. Mainland's use of the phrase to a reasonable degree of medical certainty. In its opening statement, the state called Kelly Labonte the motive. Excuse me. Throughout this case, how many times did we hear about the cruise they were planning? At some point, she described to Mark Jensen all the men she had ever been with. And yesterday, when Mr. Jamboys was cross-examining Dr. Sarah West, he argued these four things. He said, Mark Jensen and Kelly Labonte had an affair, and they had made a plan to go on a cruise in 1999. Kelly Labonte then divorced her husband. Then Julie Jensen died. Isn't that convenient? Do you remember those questions? Well, the problem is the chronology is completely off. They had an affair. No one's contesting that. Julie Jensen had an affair. Mark Jensen had an affair. I'm not saying that makes them even or something, but these affairs happened, and it's not being contested by us at one bit. Kelly Labonte talked about divorce. And then Kelly Labonte called off the affair with Mark Jensen. And buried in all the emails that were presented in this case, on October 27th, 1998, Kelly Labonte says, I did realize I need to give this a fair shot or get the hell out. I've decided to give it a fair shot first. A 6-year relationship that I fought tooth and nail for and a 1-month marriage deserves at least one bold effort. Anyway, I would very much like your support on this. I need to focus on the positives of this marriage and see what happens. Mark's response? You've always got my support. That was October 27th, 1998. Kelly Labonte called off the affair in October. She ultimately left her husband That was in January of 1999. And then she got divorced in March or April of 1999. So this argument, how convenient for Mark Jensen that Julie Jensen died after this divorce from Kelly Labonte with her husband, it's changing the facts to fit the narrative. It's clear that this marriage was in trouble well before Mark Jensen had his affair. This marriage was in so much trouble that when Julie Jensen had her affair, she actually filed for divorce in 1991. I want to talk about Ed Klug. Think of how unbelievable Ed Klug's testimony is. How unbelievable he is as a person. The Blueprint Conference was in November of 1998. Julie Jensen died a month later. Over 3 years went by, and he reached out to the police department because he had something to say. And what did he have to say? That Mark might have used a computer in the Appleton office, but all the computers have since been changed out. That's it. That was his contribution. And nobody cared. 5 more years went by, and we're now 9 years from when Julie Jensen died, and Ed Klug gets contacted. And Ed Klug suddenly has a much more interesting story for the prosecutors. You know what? A month before Julie Jensen died, Mark Jensen told Ed Klug, someone he did not have a personal relationship with, that he was looking up ways to kill his wife. Now, in 2007, he had no notes of this. He testified he didn't have notes of this. He testified he didn't write anything down. He had no notes of any conversations or any details. In 2008, he found the notes. This is one of them. They don't say the words ethylene glycol or antifreeze, but that's what he remembers, Mark told him. Why didn't Ed Klug come forward? He says it's because Mark was his boss. But Mark wasn't his boss in 2002 when he reached out to the police to tell them that Mark had used a computer. Ed Klug testified that when he called his wife at 2:34 a.m., he told her that Mark Jensen was talking about killing his wife. According to this note, and to his story, Dawn Cooper was present. Near the bottom, Mark unloaded on us. So what did Dawn Cooper say? She remembered sitting with Ed Klug and Mark Jensen in the hotel lobby after bar closing. She was going through a divorce, and they were saying supportive things to her. She remembered Ed Klug leaving to call his wife. She said there was no conversation about harming wives. She said there was no conversation about anyone using a computer to look up ways to harm a wife. She was no longer working at Stifel in 2002 when Mark got charged in this case. She testified she got a call from Ed Klug, and he said nothing about any conversation in 1998. Dawn Cooper got contacted by the prosecutors in 2007, or by the investigation. And the way she was asked about it is consistent with what Ed Klug says, that she would have been present for that conversation. And she knows it never happened. She would have remembered that. Stacy Bauer, she worked in the Appleton office. She came here and made an assertion that she heard this from Ed Klug. She also acknowledged having read Ed Klug's read about Ed Klug's testimony. And remember this, what's on the screen? That's her written statement from August 10th of 2007, which says, quote, "I have no knowledge of a conversation Mark had with Ed Klug in St. Louis regarding killing his wife," end quote. Ed Klug says that Mark was talking about a website called howtokillyourwife.com. In all the computer stuff that we've heard, have we heard anything about howtokillyourwife.com? Joan Wise was Ed Klug's longtime assistant. Do you remember that Ed Klug claimed he told all staff on the Monday after the conference about this conversation? Joan Wise says that never happened. She never heard anything about Mark Jensen from Ed Klug, except that Mark Jensen's wife had died and that she had committed suicide. That's what she heard from Ed Klug. Ed Klug never said that Mark Jensen talked about killing his wife. She gave us her opinion about Ed Klug's honesty. He's not a truthful person. Her knowledge about his reputation, you can't believe a word he says. He's an attention seeker. Ed Klug's testimony about his drunken night in 1998 is just not believable. Ed Klug is not believable. This issue of David Thompson, David Thompson acknowledged that prior to talking to Mark Jensen, he wrote a letter to his fiancée saying, "It's time to help myself." And everything about David Thompson is consistent with this, that David Thompson came up with a proposal, a crazy proposal, that somebody would be held for 6 weeks for $1,000, that he communicated that proposal to Mark Jensen, and then it's also very clear that no money ever exchanged hands. Now, you heard some phone calls. You heard some recorded phone calls between Mark and his parents. And the one that I had played, the couple that I had played, predated the ones that he was calling, where it was a three-way call with David Thompson. And you can hear the intimidation in Mark's voice. And he's talking about, "I need you to do this or I'm going to have a fight on my hands." You heard that advice from Nathaniel Clanton. Nathaniel Clanton said, "This would be the dumbest thing you've ever done," or something like that. And he said, "Beat your case fair and square." It seems like Mark took that advice because no money ever changed hands. There's this sort of peripheral theory that's been floating around in this trial, that in November of 1998, Mark Jensen had tried to kill Julie Jensen with ethylene glycol. And the only reason that this exists is because of Aaron Dillard. Now, we know that Julie Jensen threw up all over the carpet and didn't clean it up. And we've heard all about what ethylene glycol poisoning is. We didn't hear really about it from the state's witnesses. Like I mentioned earlier, no toxicologist. Their experts were Dr. Chambliss, who didn't review things, and then Dr. Mainland. But here's what's interesting about this claim, is Julie Jensen was at home with the kids. And with all the conversations and reports to the neighbors, the Voigts, and with all the phone calls to Dr. Borman when there was the slightest sickness in that household, and with the statements about the paranoid statements about maybe being poisoned or being drugged or somebody's out to get me. There's nothing about this incident. There are no reports to Dr. Borman. There's no reports to the Voigts. There's no report of breathing problems. There's no report of intoxication. There was no poisoning in November. I'd suggest that this vomit all over the carpet that wasn't cleaned up, that might be indicative of something else that was going on. Julie Jensen used the computer and she used the internet. We know this from Laura Koster. Laura Koster was an IT expert. She said that Julie Jensen used the computer and used the internet. We know this from her son, David Jensen. We know this from the Quicken software that she used when Mark was out of town. We know this from the resume she created on the computer. There's this statement from Therese DeFazio that Julie Jensen said she didn't know how to turn on a computer. And then there's a little bit more of an explanation. And Therese DeFazio talked about clearing out the cache or checking the cache. And the clarification is that Therese DeFazio, at school, they had Macs. Could that have been why Julie Jensen didn't know how to turn on the computer at school? Because at home, they weren't on just their first computer, and they had IBMs. Now, set aside the problems with the investigation. The computer wasn't write-blocked when Detective Ratsburg insisted it be turned on, and the corruption of the files that can be caused by that. Now, the state said, when they looked through these different websites, they said, we know it was Mark on some days because the website was for Bass Pro Shops and for a cruise. They looked to context to say who would have been on these sites, who would have been looking at these pages. Well, the interests of Julie's and the context of these websites tells us what was going on. This October 16th, the recipe link, a message board for cooking recipes, botulism. Who was the only one who did any cooking in the Jensen household? On October 16th, after 11 p.m., there's an access to the Stifel branch listings. And an email between Mark and Kelly Labonte from earlier that day. And then there's a search in Stifel for a Kelly, no last name. Mark Jensen knew who Kelly Labonte was, and he knew how to email her, and he knew where she worked. Julie Jensen knew who Kelly Labonte was. She knew of Kelly Labonte. This is the cover. This is the first page of Julie Jensen's day planner. And you see on the upper right corner, it says Kelly Labonte. And this lines up with what Ted Voigt said, that about 5-ish weeks before her death, that Julie Jensen knew that Mark was having an affair. The prosecution needs this to be Mark Jensen because there are searches for mercury fulminate and nicotine. The prosecution needs it to be Mark Jensen, or else it shows that Julie Jensen accessed the computer late at night. On November 10th, 1998, suicide message boards. A search for suicide, a search for physician-assisted suicide. I don't know why anyone clicks on different links after doing a search. I don't know how long Julie Jensen stayed on the page of physician-assisted suicide, but there's only one person in that house that would have been searching for suicide with what we know about the context of what was going on with Julie Jensen in those last couple of months. Look at the internet searches on December 2nd that Ms. McNeil showed you. 8:16 a.m. through 8:38 a.m. An article on ethylene glycol poisoning, oxalic acid, fomepizole, toxic alcohols, a page on how patients with toxic alcohols present, the dangers of ethanol substitutes, ethylene glycol, specific poisoning information. We heard about SSRIs from Dr. Hale, I think, and also Dr. West about the risk of certain medications and how they can ironically increase somebody's risk at suicide. The prosecution needs this to be Mark. But on December 2nd in the morning, Mark took Douglas to daycare. That was at 8 a.m. And then he went to Dr. Borman's. And after meeting with Dr. Borman, a prescription was written, and Mark Jensen took that prescription to Walgreens, where he waited for it to be filled. That was around 11:13 a.m. These searches at 8:16 a.m. to 8:38 a.m., all about ethylene glycol, it had to be Julie. On December 3rd, you have searches late at night and then in the morning. 9:40 a.m., toxic alcohols, ethylene glycol poisoning. A page on diabetic ketoacidosis. 9:42 p.m., 2 minutes later, back to the Yahoo search results for ethylene glycol poisoning. I think it was the state's first two witnesses in this case, Ruth Vorwald and Shannon Krause. 9:30-ish, they saw Mark driving. He wasn't at home. These had to be Julie. Mark had gone to pick up a check from a client. Then later he said that he stopped in the office. Now, Detective Ratsburg waited over 3 years to interview anyone at the office. And 3 years later, after Mark had been charged, they said they didn't see him that day. Well, the police searched all of Mark's property. They searched his briefcase, they searched his office. The check that he went and picked up from the client, that wasn't found at the house. This is the problem with memory. It's the problem with waiting years to talk to people. Now, we know from Dr. Hale about the late stages of ethylene glycol poisoning. There is no scientific reason that she would have been unable to go to the office and do a basic internet search. We know her body was producing urine, and there was no urine or any fluid in the bed. Julie Jensen was able to get up and go to the bathroom. We know from David Jensen that his mom hugged him and spoke with him that morning.